Hello and welcome everyone. In this series, you're going to learn about how to build headless WordPress CMS project, wherein we are going to use React in the front end with the Next.js framework, and in the back end we'll use WordPress. And we are going to use Graphql to fetch data from WordPress and serve it onto the front end. In terms of setup, we're going to use Docker for WordPress. However, if you want to use any other setup for WordPress, you can certainly do that. And if you would like to use Docker, then you can follow along from this video. So we're going to learn everything from scratch. Okay, so let's continue. So what we need to do first is install Docker Engine, and you can actually install Docker on multiple platforms. So if you're running on Mac, you can get the Docker desktop for Mac. If you're running on Windows, you can get it for Windows, and for Linux, you can just get the Docker using this link. Okay, since I'm using Mac, I can just click on this and then click on download from Docker Hub. You click on that and then finally get Docker. Okay, so once I install it, all the instructions is given how to set it up. You can follow along on that, and then finally you will have your Docker set up. Once it's set up, you should be able to see that on top like this. So you can see I've already started Docker, and you can see it's currently running. For some reason, if you run into any of the issues when working with Docker, the first and the best way to get rid of that problem is just to restart. So just click on restart. It kind of sorts out 90% of the problems. So if you run into some Docker issues, just restart this from here. Okay, so I'm assuming that you've already installed it. You can pause the video, install and set it up. And now we can continue further. The very first thing we're going to do is basically create a directory, and we'll name it as Next.js Headless WordPress. Okay, and then inside of this, we are going to create another directory, and we'll name it as backend. This is where our WordPress stays. And then later on, we'll create another directory called frontend, which is where we are going to actually keep our React application, your React theme. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'll just open up this project into the PHP Storm. You can use any of the editor that you want. So here it is. And to use Docker, we are going to need to create a file called docker compose YAML. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this, because I'm not going to spend too much time in explaining about Docker. That would probably a different video altogether, where I'll teach you about Docker if you are new to Docker. However, in this series, we'll keep our focus on to just building this application. Okay, so let's create a file called docker compose YAML. And if you want to know what this is, you can check out here on docs.docker.compose. And as you can see, it's a tool for defining and running multiple containers, multi-container Docker applications. So with Compose, you use a YAML file like we are currently doing, and then you just need to configure your application. So this is where we're going to define and then run multiple containers. Okay, so this is how it looks like. This is how this file looks like, and you can directly come over here and you can copy the code. So we're not going to spend time in writing it ourselves. So this is the version number. These are different services. So this is the Composer container that has an image called Composer. The command we're going to run is Composer update. So of course we need a Composer file for that as well. And it's going to use WordPress as a directory where it's going to run that command. So let's go ahead and create the WordPress directory quickly. So inside of the backend, I'm going to create another directory called WordPress. And inside of this, we need a Composer file. So I'm going to use this Composer file. Okay, and this is pretty useful if you ask me, because then it becomes easy for us to install all of the plugins via Composer rather than having to do that manually. But if you want to do it manually, I have created another directory here in this repo called plugins collections. So if you want to use your own setup, then make sure to download these plugins and activate them in your own WordPress install. But if you want to continue with the Docker setup, then you don't need this. It's going to automatically take care of all of this. So what this is going to do is basically use the image called Composer. Docker image called Composer is going to run Composer update command, which is going to then run it inside of the WordPress directory, and it's going to install all of these WordPress plugins via Composer. Okay, awesome. Then we also have the MySQL setup, which is this one. So this is a container for MySQL. It's using the MySQL version 8.0. And then in terms of volumes, it's going to do that inside of MySQL data. And then the Docker container path is going to be var lib mysql. I'm going to show you all of this once we have that set up. Okay, and then restart always is going to always restart in case if it stops. Okay, so the container, if the container stops running, then it's going to restart that. And these are all the environments, so you can change or update the environment if you want from here. So we are keeping the MySQL password as root, the database name as WordPress, the username as WordPress, and the password as WordPress as well. Okay, then these are the volumes. So if you want to know what volumes are, volumes basically allow you to use persistent data storage. So if you take a look on this Docker documentation, it says that the data doesn't persist when the container no longer exists. And it can be difficult to get the data out of the container if the process needs it. So Docker has like two options to store the files in the host machine so that the files are persisted even after the container stops. So one is volume and second is bind mount. So we're using volumes in our case. Okay. So you can read more about it over here. Like I said, I'll just be going through all of this very briefly and keep our focus on building the application. Okay, so this is going to use the MySQL. So this is your host, which is the data that's going to be stored locally, and this is going to be inside of your Docker container. So this is the path. I'm going to show that to you in a moment. Then you have the phpmyadmin. We are using the phpmyadmin image for that. It depends on MySQL. Host name is MySQL, port is 3306, and then again, if it stops, it's going to automatically restart, which is great. And the port that we are opening for this is 8183. On this, so if you want to go ahead and check all of the WordPress data, you can use phpmyadmin to check that, or you can use MySQL through terminal to check all of your data and perform any operations, database operation if you want. Then lastly, we have got this WordPress, and again, we are using the WordPress official WordPress latest image, and we are using port 8020. So your WordPress is going to be available on localhost 8020. Okay. Again, you already know about this restart always. The environment we are using for WordPress, the host is MySQL 3306, which is this port that we opened over here. And then this is the username, the password, and the database name, etc. Okay, again, this is for your host local folder, WordPress, which is this one. So this is where the data will be persistent. And then this is for the Docker container. All right. The benefit of using this is that the container will share the file, the same file, with your local host, which means that if you make any changes to your WordPress files, you don't have to do anything out of the box. It will automatically be visible. Those changes will be visible onto your site. All right, awesome, sounds good. Now let's do some magic. All right, so now I want to go ahead and use that Docker Compose YAML file that we created, and so that it uses those images to then spin up the containers and we set up our WordPress project, right? So how do we do that? Well, there is a command in Docker called Docker Compose, and let's see what's available inside of it by just running it here. Okay, so what do we have? You see that this is the usage, Docker Compose, and then it's asked you for using the F flag, which is specify the composer file. The default is going to use this. Otherwise, you can specify the path to that particular compose file. Okay, and then you have to pass different options. So for example, if you want to run it into detached mode, wherein you don't want to see all of the progresses and you can continue with your work while it's doing its job, you can use -d. But in our case, I want to show you what's happening, so that's why I'm not going to use the detached mode. Okay, let me clear it. So I'll say docker compose, and remember, we have to use the -f because we want to specify the path. The reason for this is because our Docker compose file is inside of the backend directory, right? So I have to specify the path because I'm running it from the root. So backend slash. So backend slash docker compose YAML, and then I have to do up. I won't do the -d. If you want to run into detached mode, you can use -d. All right. Let's hit it, see what happens. You can see it's creating the backend default, which is the default driver. It's creating the image. It has given the name automatically. It just picked up any name automatically because it's actually using the backend directory as the name. And you can see it's going ahead and spinning up the containers. Okay, just going to take some time for it to do its work. It's currently doing it with the MySQL, and if you go on top, so this is the container name for the composer, which is our first one. Then you have the MySQL, which is this container, and it's using the name backend. So this backend name is coming from here, and then it's using MySQL_1. Okay, so it's creating the name on its own. And then you have this phpmyadmin container name over here. And then you finally have the backend WordPress, right? Which is this one. Now let's take a look. Now you can see that it's running the composer update, right? So it's installing all of the packages that we have asked it to inside of our WordPress directory. Now you can see it's got all of the files now, which wasn't there earlier, and it's using the composer update to install all of the packages. Yep. So you have all of the dependencies being installed because the Yoast has some dependencies you need to install. Now it's also created the composer log file, which is great for us. It's created the .htxs, so your entire WordPress is set up. You have vendor file wherein it has all of the vendor dependencies. Okay. Can you see that the composer one is exited with the code 0 because the job of the composer container is done, so it's now exited. All right, and now it will continue to run because we are not running it inside of the detached mode. All right, so all we have to do now is our WordPress, as we discussed, is actually going to be available on 8020. All right, so let's go to localhost 8020, hit it. There you go, congratulations. So now you've got your WordPress, and you just need to set it up, install it. So click continue. I'm going to name my site as Next.js Headless WordPress. You can change it if you want later. I'll give the name as username as root, password as root as well. And then I'm going to just click this because it's my local setup. For the production, you may want to set up a better username and better password, which is more secure. And then I'm just going to use this email address and then install WordPress. Okay, congratulations. All I have to do is log in now. I'll just do root, password is root, login. There you go, congratulations. You've got this set up. Now, if you go to the plugins directory, and if you check your composer file, let's go to composer.json. And if you take a look, you've got Headless CMS. So this is the plugin, Headless CMS. Let's activate that. We've got WP GraphQL, so this turns your WordPress into a GraphQL server, so you can then query the WordPress data using GraphQL. So let's activate that. Right. So okay, that's for GraphQL. Then you have the WP GraphQL Gutenberg, which is this plugin. The reason why we are using this is because when we are actually creating the components for the front-end React application, then at that time we may have to break the blocks and create React components for those blocks. And when we get the data in GraphQL by default, it just dumps out all of the HTML. We don't get them in broken into pieces. So basically it's going to go ahead and make sure that we have the parsed block available as JSON to query in GraphQL, from GraphQL, and then we'll be able to use that in the front end. So you activate that, and you have to make sure that you update the block registry. So if you take a look at WP GraphQL Gutenberg, and it also has some documentation. So it extends the WP GraphQL schema with the new fields and types, and you get structured data for the post, which uses the block editor. So you can see it talks about that the Gutenberg main issue lies within the client-side only architecture for registering and validating blocks. But it's not really available. The block registry is not available on the PHP side of WordPress. So this exposes many of those challenges and exposes that those blocks so that you can query them through GraphQL, and that's why we are updating the block registry over here. Okay, just so that you know. Next plugin is WP GraphQL Gutenberg Acf. So if we want to use ACF, this adds support for that, so that even the dynamic block that we create by ACF is going to be available to query via GraphQL. So we'll activate this one as well. Okay, it says that you have to activate the advanced custom field, so let's do that. So here it is. So we're going to activate ACF plugin. Also activate the WP GraphQL for advanced custom fields, and then finally the WP GraphQL Gutenberg Acf. Okay, awesome. This is done. All right. And then we also have the WP GraphQL offset pagination. So we're going to use this to create pagination on the front end, and we'll talk about in detail about why we're using this. Okay, in later videos. Then comes the Yoast. Now we can activate the Yoast from here. However, you will notice when I do that, there's some error that you get. So let's click it. There you go. You can see that it says activation failed, Yoast SEO plugin installation incomplete. So let's search what the issue is on the Yoast. So Yoast WordPress plugin GitHub. I'm going to search this issue on the GitHub. Okay. And I'm going to go to the issues. I'll go to the closed ones, and I'll just search it. So you can see installing plugin via Composer won't activate. Let's go with this one. And then here the explanation is given. Again, I will not go into detail of it. You can read about it, but it basically talks about that if the plugin is required as dependency, it needs to have the auto load. Okay. So then someone suggested that you can go ahead and auto load it using this required ones, vendor auto load. So basically it's talking about auto loading this vendor directory, which is kind of requirement for this plugin when doing with Composer. If you're doing it regularly by just downloading it through WordPress and activating it's fine. But if you're doing it via Composer, you may run up into a situation like this. So all you have to do is copy it and come to the config, WP config, and just add that here right on top of it. So iFender is saying that add it inside of WP settings.php, but since WP settings.php, if you add this before this, it anyways means that you are adding it before this particular requirement, which is great. So now if you go back and check, there are two things I like you to consider. The first, if I activate it, it solves the problem. Congratulations, the plugin is activated. This is awesome. The second is that if you notice, if you make any changes, local file, it is automatically updated, and that's why you can see the change here, right? This solved the problem. And the reason for this, like I explained to you earlier, was that the host, which is your local, and the containers are going to share the files. So which means if you make any changes here, they're going to be automatically available. Okay, which is great, which is brilliant. All right, and the last one is WP GraphQL Yoast SEO. So Yoast goes ahead and adds some data on your front-end side but because we're using headless, it won't automatically be available for you to include your meta tags, your open graph tags for Facebook share, for SEO purposes, etc. So for that, we need an extension to WP GraphQL plugin, which allows us to access this SEO data, and then we can then use that in the front end. So that plugin is WP GraphQL Yoast SEO, which is, yeah, this one. So let's activate this one. All right, so looks like I've got all of the plugins activated, which is brilliant. All right, so in the next video, I'm going to show you the phpmyadmin as well. I'm going to go ahead and SSH into the containers and show you how the files are set up there. All right, and I hope you did like the video. If you did, please give a thumbs up and do subscribe to my channel if you aren't already. And do star my repository to support my work, and also follow me on GitHub. My GitHub handle is imranhsayed. Okay, all right then, see you in the next video. Thank you very much.